Before anything else, I need to mention that this model was made with the 3.6 Long-Term Support or LTS version of Blender. Currently, the latest version is Blender 4.0, but this model is not compatible. The rig UI wouldn't work, so make sure to use a version of Blender before 4.0. Moving on to the model, when you open the file, this is what you should see. A model with textures, rig controls, and this little pop-up. This is the rig UI script, and I recommend that you check Permanently Allow Execution of Scripts so it will stop appearing every time you open the file. After that, you should see these buttons appear. Another way to get the script is by opening a text editor section, then click the little folder and locate the Python file that came with this model. Then just run the script. Okay, now let's talk about the bones, starting with the root bone. This guy controls the whole thing. If you want to move the whole character with all its controls, use this bone. Then there's the center of gravity. It has the same star shape and it also shares a similar role. This bone moves everything except for the IK controls. You use it to move the whole torso, so if you want her to jump or sit down, use this bone. We also have the upper torso, the chest, the breast, the hips. By the way, to rotate, you press R, pressing it twice you get this behavior, the trackball rotation. The torso group also contains the ears and the tail. The tail has two bones, one controls the direction of the tail starting at the base, the other rotates the whole length. Now onto the face, starting with the jaw. You can see the corners of the mouth follow it, so you'll probably have to adjust their placement. With the whole rig, but especially the face, take advantage of the rotation of the bones. Use either local or normal transform orientations. At least for bones, they seem to behave the same. This way, if you press R, G or S with any of the axes, X, Y or Z, the bone will move on its own axis instead of the global axis. The controls for the face are pretty straightforward except for the eyes, which have two controls. Use the big circle to rotate the eye into position and the little square for scaling the eye. Feel free to move the eye back or forward to avoid clipping or avoid a big gap. Same with the eyelids and the lips. Don't forget to pull up the cheeks for expressions like a smile. You could even scale it so it's fuller. Now let's get to the controls inside the mouth. While it's not very realistic to move the teeth, don't hesitate to do so for the sake of getting the expression you want. I recommend you pose the tongue by first moving the base and working your way towards the tip. By the way, the tongue might be a little too thick, so you could scale it on the Z-axis. Let's move to the limbs. For the arms, you have two options, IK, inverse kinematics, or FK, forward kinematics. FK means you move each bone, starting from the shoulder, then the arm, the forearm, and hand. By the way, the forearm only moves on one direction, so if you want to rotate the direction of the forearm, you need to rotate the arm on its Y-axis. For IK, you need to go to the Properties bone and you will see a few options appear. The first options are Arm IK/FK, and the .L and .R stand for the character's left and right sides. When set to 1, it's set to FK. When set to 0, it's set to IK. Right now, these buttons are yellow because they have a keyframe. This means that if you move through the timeline, when you go back, it will reset to the keyframe that's already set. You can hover over the button and press I to set a keyframe. Now you will see that you can move the arm controls and nothing changes. That's because those are the FK arm controls. You can hide those now and instead select the IK controls. Now all you have to work with are a rectangle and a diamond. The rectangle is the hand control. Move it and the whole arm follows. The elbows always point towards the diamond, so move the diamond to change the arm orientation. With IK, I tend to forget the shoulders a bit, so this is a reminder to keep them in mind, to avoid weird, unnatural looking poses. Let's go back to the FK arms because I want to show you another option in the Properties bone. Let's set a random pose for the arms. Back to the Properties, the next two options are Arm Follow .L and .R. Right now they are at 1, meaning they are following the torso 100%. But if you set it to 0 and now move the torso again, you'll see the arms no longer follow the torso. They remain in the same position. They still move a bit because they are still connected to the torso, but you'll see they retain the 90-degree angle. From what I understand, this is mostly an option for animation. But as you know, I don't have much experience there, so I still don't have a good example of when this can be useful, but usually I activate this when I already have a pose, but I need to readjust the torso and I don't want the pose to break too much. Moving to the hands, we have 3 buttons, Hand Master, Finger Master, and Tweak Fingers. Hand Master is 5 bones per hand. This oval is mostly for rotating on the Z-axis and getting this. It can also sort of open and close the fingers. The big rectangle controls the first joint of the fingers. You mainly rotate them on the Z-axis, but rotating on X and even Y in some cases can be useful too. This little arch above the rectangle is for rotating the fingers. With these bones, you can make a decent fist very fast. The last two bones are for the thumb. The rectangle rotates the thumb at the base of the hand, and the little arch rotates the other two segments. You can get very far with just these controls, but if you need a bit more control over the individual fingers, you can select the Finger Master group of bones. Now you have access to the segments before and after the knuckle of each finger, and you have an arch control for each one as well. Again, similar to the previous arches, this one rotates the whole finger and scaling rotates only the first segment of the finger. This should hopefully be enough to get any pose you need for the fingers, but you can still open the Tweak Fingers group and you'll have the whole hand available to you. Now, for the legs, we only have IK. You have a control for the feet, for the toes, a pole target, which is the same as the diamond for the arm. This time the knees are pointing towards it, and we have a foot roll control. This control is very useful for walking animations. You can imagine as the character gives a step, it first lands with the heel, then it plants the sole of the foot on the ground, and as it leaves the ground for another step, the toes are the last to leave the ground. When you rotate and move the foot, you'll notice the pole target moves along. In most cases, this is the behavior you want, but there might be times where you want to move the feet freely, independently from the orientation of the leg. To get this behavior, you'll need to enter Edit mode and make the pole target a child of the root bone, instead of the foot control. By the way, when using IK bones, especially the feet, it can be very useful to change the transform orientation to global for a moment. Here you can see the global axis. You can even interact with it. It disappears while the gizmo is hidden. You can also show the global axis here in the overlays and the floor grid. We're just missing the clothes and the hair. Let's go to the hair. Hair type first. The controls are very straightforward. You have a control for the hair before the ponytail, one for the scrunchie I believe they're called, one for the direction of the ponytail, and another for the rotation of the rest of the ponytail. For the scrunchie, it's meant to rotate around the hair, but side to side you might need to move it to avoid clipping. Also, I recommend that when moving the ponytail, you start from the top and use all these other bones to get it as close as you can to the pose you want. It's going to help a lot with keeping the hair looking nice. If you need extra control of the ponytail, you find all the bones in the Tweaks chain group. This group also has the rest of the bones for the tail. Now the hair down. To activate it, go to the properties bone and it's not very intuitive, but 0 is when the hair is showing and 1 is hidden. Just hide the hair type and unhide the hair down. Keyframe it so it stays, and let's select the hair down group. Hopefully this set of bones is all you need. This rectangle or long cube thing moves the base of the lock of hair. For the back of the head it moves 2 locks at a time, the top and bottom layers, and the eyebrows are for twisting and rotating the whole lock of hair. If you need extra control, then you can unhide the groups top tweak and bottom tweak. As you can imagine, the top tweak group is for the layer of hair on top, and the bottom tweak is for the hair at the bottom. By the way, I think this is a good time to talk about the transform pivot point. You will probably want the pivot point set to individual origins most of the time, at least when it comes to posing characters. But keep this in mind because there's times you might want to change it. For example, you could use the 3D cursor to move the whole character on a different pivot point, or rotate other bones around the last selected bone. You can also rotate not on an axis but according to your view by pressing only R. Speaking of, views are also very important when posing. I already talked about this thing, but you can use it to click on the axis you want the view to align with. You can also use the numpad shortcuts. Number 1 is front view, Ctrl 1 is back view. Number 3 is side view, Ctrl 3 is the other side. 7 is top view, Ctrl 7 is from the bottom, and you can also use 9 to flip whatever view you have. Number 5 is for perspective view and orthographic view, which are very important. Orthographic is useful to move, rotate, and just manipulate things in a more precise and predictable way. But don't forget perspective view, since this is closer to the way things will look once you render an image or animation using a camera. By the way, you can change the perspective, the local length, like a camera. In the end panel, just go to view and in focal length, change the number. The smaller the number, the more fish eye it looks. The bigger the number, the more flat it looks, almost orthographic. But before I just keep going with little bits of information, let's go back to the rig and talk about the last bone group, the clothes. There's bones for the neck and for the skirt. The neck is pretty simple, either rotate it or move it. Personally, I usually had to move it on its y-axis a lot to avoid the head clipping with it. The skirt is divided into 8 areas with 3 bones each. If you need to rotate or move any bone, feel free to do so. This is the order I will follow. Move up the long triangle, rotate the rectangle up and maybe to the sides or twist it to get rid of most of the clipping. And then, only if necessary, move the big triangle at the ends of the skirt. Now let's go back to the properties bone to talk about the last 2 properties. First, pixelated. When you change it from 0 to 1, it might not be immediately obvious, but the change is that the textures now look pixelated instead of fuzzy. Personally, I really like both. I did work with the fuzzy textures as I was painting them, but I really like the pixelated look as well, so the option is there to choose whichever you prefer. Now the contour is going to do something that looks really weird at first because it's not meant to be viewed in solid mode, but rather in the material preview and rendered modes. As you can see, now she's got a red contour. I honestly didn't expect it would work so well, or at least I really like the way it looks. It's much easier to read the pose right away. I still prefer to deactivate it while posing the character though. I chose a red color for the contour, but you can change it if you want. Just go to Object Mode, select any mesh of the character, and then go to Material. Select the outline material, and then in Surface you can change the base color. You can also change the color of the background. Just go to World and the color is right there. Changing the strength makes the background brighter or darker, which affects the character. And that's pretty much it, at least as far as the character and the rig goes. There's still some explanations and tips I can give to help with posing the character. For example, the reason I have my viewport split like this is to quickly look at a version of the model without the clutter. This area has the Show Gizmo and Show Overlay buttons deactivated. Something else that might make it easier to read the pose is going to viewport shading and activating stuff like shadow, cavity, or the outline. Also, instead of flat, change to studio, maybe select this lighting, but keep in mind that you are going to get weird shadows. I have opened 2, I think they're called editors, related to animation, the top sheet and the timeline. I keep an open but minimized timeline editor to change the frames of the playback. You could also activate the auto keying. It can be really handy when making adjustments to your poses. Oh, and if you're animating, definitely go to playback and choose frame dropping. That will give you a playback that's as close as possible to your timing and keyframes. And that's pretty much it. I use the top sheet for everything else. Let's move on to the top sheet. This is the rig, and inside is every bone. Inside each bone is the location, rotation, and scale of each axis. And for the properties bone, you'll also find each of the properties. These dots are the keyframes. I think by default it's set to only show selected, but if you deactivate the option, you will always see every single bone. To delete all my keyframes, make sure only show selected is turned off and show hidden is turned on. Then, while hovering over the top sheet, select everything by pressing A, all the keyframes, and just press X and delete keyframes. That will give you a fresh timeline. To get the character back to the resting pose, select every button of the rig UI, press A to select all bones, and then press Alt-R, Alt-G, and Alt-S. This will clear all location, rotation, and scale changes. While making poses, I try to hide bones I'm not using so it's easier to see everything. But as soon as I have a pose I like, I unhide almost the whole rig and select everything, and by pressing I, set a keyframe. I choose location, rotation, and scale. I only keep bones hidden that I'm sure I'm not going to need. For example, I know I'm not going to change the hair, so I don't unhide the hair down groups. I also know I don't use the bones in the twigs chain, or the twig fingers. However, even if I didn't use it right now, I know that in a future pose I might need to move the teeth, so I did unhide them, again even if I didn't change anything in this pose. This is because if later on I make a pose that does have changes inside the mouth, when I keyframe it, it's going to affect all previous poses that don't have a keyframe. If you wanted to move all the keyframes from, for example, frame 5 to frame 10, you can select absolutely everything by selecting the keyframe in summary. If you wanted to select multiple keyframes, you could use box select by pressing B. With the poses I made, if you press the spacebar to play the animation, you'll notice that she jumps from pose to pose, instead of gradually moving to the next pose. The way I did that was selecting all the keyframes, then right-click, and in interpolation mode, I selected constant. Linear means it will move at a constant pace towards the next pose, and Bezier by default is going to ease in and out, and then you could go to the graph editor and adjust the curve. The difference between linear and Bezier is not super obvious, but in the graph editor it becomes more clear. I made the first two linear, while I made the last two frames Bezier. Linear is a straight line. This type of line is very good for robotic machine movements, moving at a constant pace. The Bezier curve is going slow at first, then it speeds up in the middle and slows down again at the end. The graph editor is a whole topic that I'm still learning and getting used to, so I wouldn't be able to go into more detail at the moment. And I think that's it. This is hopefully enough information to get you started. I really hope you give it a try, and also that you have fun posing her, maybe even animating her a bit if you want. Thank you guys so much for your support and your patience on this late reward. Again, I really hope you like it. Goodbye and happy 2024.